Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is infamy. The year is 1941. For the first time in American history, a president is taking the oath of office for the third time. Franklin Roosevelt ready to begin his third term in a time of global war. Lots on his mind, bit of a philosophical bent to his inaugural address, talking about something very important and kind of cherished to him, democracy. According to Roosevelt, we know it because democracy alone has constructed an unlimited civilization, capable of infinite progress in the improvement of human life. We know it because if we look below the surface, we sense it still spreading on every continent, for it is the most humane, the most advanced, and in the end, the most unconquerable of all forms of human society. The democratic aspiration is no mere recent phase in human history, it is human history, and it was very much under assault in this war going on around the globe. Well, that war would take a very different turn in June of 1941 when Germany's Adolf Hitler decided to break his mutual non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and launch an invasion of Russia. And it was another German blitz. 600,000 people they captured in just 4 days, traveling 200 miles well deep into the lands of the Soviet Union. What were the Americans and the British going to do about this? Now, neither were fans of the communists, neither really, they were kind of leery of the Soviet premier, Joseph Stalin, but in the concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Roosevelt believed it's actually wise to come to the aid of the Soviets. He said that he deemed it of paramount importance for the safety and security of America that all reasonable munitions help be provided for Russia. In fact, he agreed to have Lend-Lease extended to the Soviets almost immediately. Nearly $2 billion in munitions and supplies would be provided in that very first tranche of support for Russia in now its fight against the Germans. Now, there was some howling criticism of Roosevelt on this regard, particularly coming from the American right, Herbert Hoover leading the charge, and he said at the time that it would be better served for the great dictators to destroy each other. To align American ideals alongside Stalin will be as a great violation of everything American as to align ourselves with Hitler. In fact, with pretty great prescience, Hoover made the comment that 5 years after this war, we'll be arming Germany and Japan to help protect us from Russia. Interesting thought about the future, but for now, that wasn't what was on Roosevelt's mind. He wasn't worried about the long-term future nearly as much as the present. And Adolf Hitler was the greatest threat to humanity right now. He would do anything he could to stop Adolf Hitler. Any defense against Hitlerism, according to Roosevelt, from whatever source, will benefit our own defense and security. Roosevelt's still trying to keep the United States out of war, but trying to help those in it anything they could to defeat Germany and Adolf Hitler. Well, the powers of personal diplomacy were always important to Franklin Roosevelt. He was really good at it. He wanted to meet Winston Churchill in person. They had already formed a bond, international bond across the Atlantic in terms of their trying to support each other in this fight against Hitler, but they wanted to meet in person and they agreed to do so in August, early August of 1941. It was a secret mission. Roosevelt got on the presidential yacht, the Potomac, and was figuring on a vacation in the New England coast where really his goal was to get to Newfoundland, one of those new bases that the Americans had acquired from Britain in the trade and the Lend-Lease deal for destroyers. And they met there with Winston Churchill and they hit it off immediately. Not just on their policy alignment, but their personalities. They enjoyed each other's company. They were frank in their discussions with each other. They felt they really could not only get along, but work together. The first of 10 important meetings between Roosevelt and Churchill through the balance of World War II. Really a remarkable partnership dedicated to try to save the world against fascist domination. Well, they also revealed at this gathering something they called the Atlantic Charter, which was kind of a set of principles not that dissimilar to what Woodrow Wilson had put out with his 14 points at the time of World War I. Comments about their goals for this war: no territorial gains, self-determination for peoples, lowering trade barriers, freedom of the seas. Again, a set of concepts and principles that people could rally around while the Americans are supporting the British, but again, the Americans still on the outside of this fight, not yet engaged in fighting in the war. When Roosevelt returned from Newfoundland, he had some personal losses. A couple very close to him, including Missy LeHand. She's only 43 years old, but she's been with Roosevelt basically every day for the last 20 years. She suffered a stroke, a bad stroke, and frankly, physically, she would never be the same. She was a lot more than a reliable aide and secretary to Roosevelt. She had been his constant companion, again, living under his roof at the governor's mansion, in the White House, very close. And now all of a sudden, he was going to have to figure out how to be president of the United States in this terrible, difficult times in the world without Missy LeHand at his side. Grace Tully, who had also been with him now for quite some time, would step into that role, but again, not nearly the closeness and intimacy that he had experienced with Missy LeHand. And then perhaps the person who was most important in Roosevelt's life in the very beginning, his mother, Sara Roosevelt, well, she died just shy of her 87th birthday. Again, she had been there from the very beginning, always supportive of Roosevelt, personally, emotionally, financially. She had been there to see him inaugurated as president. In fact, she became the first presidential mom to write a memoir, this book here, My Boy Franklin, that came out right at the beginning of the Roosevelt's first term in office. Well, now she passed away, again, just shy of her 87th birthday. Roosevelt and Eleanor were both there when she passed. They buried her at Hyde Park next to her husband, who had been buried 41 years before. Back to the war. To date, Roosevelt's focus has primarily been on Europe and the Atlantic, but there was saber-rattling going on in the Pacific with Japan. The relationships between the United States and Japan had not been very good for a while. They had immigration conflicts back in the 1920s, and then when Japan invaded Manchuria in the early 1930s, full-on scale invasion of China in 1937, an ally of the United States. So things had been a bit at odds between these two countries, and now the United States was getting pretty nervous that the Japanese were going to be even more imperialistic, perhaps move on to invade some of the nations to their south, where they had so many raw materials that the Japanese, as an island nation, really needed. In early 1941, Roosevelt met with the new ambassador to the United States, Kichiasaburo Nomura, and he told him that there is plenty of room in the Pacific area for everybody. It would not do this country any good, nor Japan any good, but both of them harm to get into war. But talk wasn't really going to get there. This was about action. And the imperialistic nature of what was going on in Japan, the worry about further invasions, the United States decided to impose sanctions on Japan. Iron, steel scrap, and most importantly, oil. Japan got about 80% of its oil from the United States, and pretty nearly now the nation was cut off from these supplies. And how was Japan going to respond to this? Because the intent was to get the Japanese to kind of curb their imperialistic ambitions. Well, with the Japanese, it kind of did the opposite. They invaded French Indochina almost immediately, upon which the United States expanded the embargo to even more supplies, lent another $100 million to China in their aid against Japan. Japan got more militant. Where is this going to end? A lot of people are nervous. There was an expectation that the Japanese would strike somewhere in the Pacific. But one thing they did not worry about, the U.S. fleet based in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, made the comment to FDR that the island of Oahu, due to its fortification, its garrison, and its physical characteristics, is believed to be the strongest fortress in the world. With the force available to defend it, a major attack against Oahu is considered impractical. Well, the more militant side of things on Japan were making it very difficult for the Prime Minister, Prince Fumimaro Konoye. He was trying again to still find a way to be peaceful with the United States. So he took a secret meeting with the U.S. Ambassador Joseph Grew. They met for a couple of hours, and what Konoye really wanted was a meeting with Roosevelt, a chance, maybe a summit, a one-on-one discussion to try to put these issues aside. And Grew thought this was a good idea. He recommended it to the president. The president met with his cabinet, and they said no. Unless you can get an agreement in advance of the summit, this has a sort of potential for disaster written all over it. Revise against the meeting unless you had an agreement in advance. Well, that wasn't going to be the way the Japanese would pursue. So Konoye actually resigned as prime minister, a shakeup in the government in Japan. The Emperor Hirohito went to the military. General Hidecki Tojo was made the prime minister, and immediately they signed a pact with Germany and Italy, a mutual non-aggression pact that would also bring defense in case one of those was attacked. The others would come to their defense. Tensions were white hot when it came to Japan. Japan. Now, Admiral Nomura was given until November the 25th, 1941 to strike a deal with the United States, or else the military was going to take over. He made offers to the United States on November the 6th and November the 20th. They agreed to leave South Indochina. They also agreed to freeze their military deployments, except for China. That was going to continue as long as the U.S. would resume the shipments of those raw materials. Well, for the United States, wasn't good enough. The Americans countered with a bold proposition that the Japanese withdraw from China entirely, sign a non-aggression pact with the U.S. and with Great Britain and a few other things. Well, there was no way the Japanese were going to accept this. Both sides knew it. And eventually the Prime Minister, Tojo, on December the 1st, made the conclusion that it is now clear that Japan's claims cannot be attained through diplomatic means. At this moment, our empire stands on the threshold of glory or oblivion. He talked to his cabinet and they unanimously agreed, we need to attack the United States and go into war. The emperor also signed on because the plans for such an attack had actually been underway for almost a year. They were in the hands of the Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet of the Japanese, and his plan was a surprise attack to annihilate the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. And having follow-up simultaneous attacks throughout the Pacific, his goal was to set up kind of an impregnable defensive line, generate regional hegemony for the Japanese, but the key of all of this was the surprise attack to knock out the U.S. fleet. Well, on December the 1st, he was given the order to proceed. A massive armada about to go and attack at Pearl Harbor, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 11 destroyers, 9 oilers, 35 submarines, all going to attack the Americans. Well, Roosevelt didn't know anything about this happening. He did have a sense that the Japanese were going to attack somewhere in the South Pacific. He did not believe that it would be at Pearl Harbor and an attack directly on the United States. So on December the 6th, trying to avoid war, Roosevelt sent a sort of a last-ditch note directly to the Japanese emperor, Hirohito. Both of us, for the sake of the peoples, not only of our own great countries, but for the sake of humanity and neighboring territories, have a sacred duty to restore traditional amity and prevent further death and destruction to the world, he wrote to Hirohito. Of course, it was too little too late, as the attack was actually already about to start. Now, the president and his leadership team had warned the folks in Pearl Harbor that the Japanese were likely to attack somewhere pretty soon. In fact, he said that weekend we were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. That Monday was December the 8th. This was now December the 7th. And while the White House told the people in Hawaii to be on alert, they really weren't expecting anything to come close to them at Pearl Harbor. There were actually minimum air patrols going on at Pearl Harbor. The ships were all kind of lined up in port, one next to each other. Airplanes in this open air field lined up wingtip to wingtip. Radar was working, but only sort of part of the day. And in fact, the morning of December the 7th, the radar operators spotted something coming in. They were alerted to their superiors, and the superiors said, don't worry about it. It's probably just this group of American B-17s that we're expecting to come in. Well, on that fateful morning of December the 7th, the Japanese launched that full-scale attack. And their goal to knock out the U.S. fleet, well, it had a lot of success. 8 battleships, 11 other ships were sunk or disabled. More than 300 American aircraft were either destroyed or disabled. In fact, most of those never got into the air. They were almost all attacked and destroyed on the ground. The Americans suffered in the Battle of Pearl Harbor 2,403 killed, another 1,178 wounded. Almost half the dead were entombed for eternity in the USS Arizona, which was sunk in Pearl Harbor with 1,103 sailors still aboard. The Japanese, well, they suffered barely anything. They lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget subs, and 129 personnel. So this was clearly, from the Japanese perspective, a major success. But there were some limitations. There were some things that they missed. The massive oil stores for the United States at Pearl Harbor were not bombed in this. That would be helpful, certainly, going forward. Most importantly, the United States' 3 aircraft carriers that were in the Pacific at the time were not in port. They were out to sea, and so they were saved from this surprise attack. Franklin Roosevelt heard about the attack on December the 7th at 1:40 in the afternoon. He was having a late lunch. He got a call from Secretary Frank Knox, the Navy Secretary. He bemoaned this. He couldn't believe the audacity of the Japanese, and he was also decrying the fact that the Americans did so little in terms of their ability to launch a defense. All those airplanes that were knocked out before they got into the skies, Roosevelt said, "On the ground, by God, on the ground," lamenting that the aircraft never even got up into the fight. Chaos was all around the White House at the time, and typically when that happened, Roosevelt was the calmest one in the room. He met with his cabinet that afternoon. He met with congressional leadership that night. He asked for time for the next day to go to Congress to speak, and he did. A brief message he wrote by hand, actually dictated to Grace Tully, where he made a couple of changes by hand, but it was his words, only about 500 words. The speech was less than 6.5 minutes long, but it was impactful, including the opening line. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He went on in this brief address to ask for a declaration of war. Congress turned around and gave it to him almost immediately. Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States in support of Japan. The Americans then declared war on Germany and Italy. World War II had come to the shores of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt was now commander-in-chief. That is Franklin Roosevelt, an infamy from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.